me the option to remain in Corinthians or preach another message to do with revival. So I'm going to do that. Open your Bibles, if you would, to the book of Mark, chapter 6. Mark chapter 6. The Lord gave me this message several months ago. I was in Eufaula, Alabama, and I was supposed to, and I was preaching that night, and I was going to preach the message that I'm about to preach now. While I was in men's prayer meeting, the Lord moved me in a different direction. So I have not got to preach this message yet. I'm looking forward to preaching it. I hope that you'll find it motivating. Mark chapter 6. Let me see what verse I want to start in here. There's a lot I'd like to get to, but we probably won't get to all of it. We'll begin reading in verse 30. And the disciples gathered themselves together unto Jesus, and told him all things both they had done and what they had taught. And he said unto them, Come ye yourselves apart into a desert place, and rest a while, for there were many coming and going, and they had no leisure so much as to eat. And they departed into a desert place by ship privately. And the people saw them departing, and many knew him, and ran afoot thither out of all cities, and outwent them, and came together unto him. And Jesus, when he came out, saw much people, and was moved with compassion toward them, because they were as sheep not having a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when the day was now far spent, his disciples came unto him and said, This is a desert place, and now the time is far past. Send them away that they may go into the country round about, and into the villages, and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. He answered and said unto them, Give ye them to eat. And they say unto him, Shall we go and buy 200 pennies worth of bread, and give them to eat? And he saith unto them, How many loaves have ye? Go and see. And when they knew, they say, 5 and 2 fishes. And he commanded them to make all sit down by companies upon the green grass. And they sat down in ranks by hundreds and by 50s. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, he looked up to heaven and blessed and brake the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fishes divided he among them all. And they did all eat and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fishes. And they that did eat of the loaves were about 5,000 men. And straightway he constrained his disciples to get into the ship, and to go to the other side before unto Bethesda, while he sent away the people. And when he had sent them away, he departed into a mountain to pray. And when evening was come, the ship was in the midst of the sea, and he alone on the land. And he saw them toiling and rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them. And about the 4th watch of the night, he cometh unto them walking upon the sea, and would have passed by them. But when they saw him walking upon the sea, they supposed it had been a spirit, and cried out, for they all saw him and were troubled. And immediately he talked with them, and saith unto them, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. And he went up into the ship, and the wind ceased, and they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure, and wondered. For they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. All right, so that's the account. Now, just by way of information, there's some things that you might want to know about this, some things you might find interesting. First of all, in preparation for this message, I read the Gospels, and it's really good when you get a chance to read all the Gospels, because then you get all the different perspectives. You get all the different perspectives, and you get all the different points of view, because Remember this. There are no mistakes in the Bible. There are no contradictions. There are no discrepancies in the Bible. But what the Lord did, He told them what to write. They wrote as they were moved by the Holy Ghost or the Holy Spirit. But He did allow them to write through their own personality. He allowed them to write showing different perspectives. And this is the only miracle. This is the only miracle that Christ ever performed that's in all four Gospels. It's the only one. And also, it's the most public miracle that He performed, by and large. Because a lot of times He said, hey, don't tell anybody. When He'd perform a miracle and say, hey, don't tell anybody. And what would they do? They would go and tell everybody. But in this case, the Bible says there were 5,000 men. Now we can do all the math. If all the men were married, which they certainly were not, there were certainly a lot of single people there. Probably a lot of children there. So there were thousands. Now we don't know how many of them saw the miracle. Like if you're in the back of the line and somebody passes you a plate of fish, you're not going to really ask where it came from. I mean, me and my wife, we do pretty well. But if you hand me a plate of fish, I'm just going to eat it. I'm not going to ask too many questions. You know, the verse in Corinthians says, eat what's put in front of you and don't ask any questions. Of course, I'm taking that out of context. But if you're at the back of the line, you may not ask any questions. But still in all, this miracle was performed in front of thousands of people. And so it's mentioned in all four Gospels. It's performed in front of thousands of people. And also, there was a lot going on. There was a lot going on when this happened. First of all, if you, by the way, you can find this even more elaborated upon in Matthew. You'll find it in Matthew 14. You'll find it here in Mark 6. You'll find it in Luke 9, and you'll find it in John 6. Now, John the Baptist had just been killed during this time. John the Baptist had just been martyred. Jesus' good friend and colleague and relative. They were related. And he called John the Baptist the greatest man born of woman. So obviously, and of course, John the Baptist was a forerunner of Christ. So John the Baptist had been killed during this time. And also, the disciples had just gotten back. Up in verse 30, when it says they wanted to talk about what they had seen and what they had taught, that's what he's talking about. He had just sent them out into all the neighboring villages. And he said, take neither person nor script. You freely receive, so freely give. And if they don't accept you, shake the dust off your feet. And if you read, now we didn't have time to read all this, but if you read in the first part of chapter 6, they performed miracles. They performed a lot of miracles. So John the Baptist had recently been martyred. They had just gotten back, and Jesus wanted to get off by himself and talk to them. He wanted to get off by himself and counsel them. Can you imagine? It gives me chills thinking about it. Can you imagine getting counsel from Jesus? Can you imagine Jesus sitting down and critiquing you? You tell him what you did, and he tells you maybe. He pulls you aside and says, because obviously he knows exactly what you did. See, when I tell Brother Owen what I did, Brother Owen's got to go by what I say. But Jesus knew everything. But can you imagine getting critiqued and getting advised and counsel? I've gotten a lot of counsel in my life from a lot of good men. Of course, counsel from people kind of fluctuates. You ever notice that? When you agree with somebody, when you're on their side, boy, I mean, they'll tell you, they'll make you feel like you can take on hell with a water pistol. Man, when you're on their side, boy, you're an awesome preacher. Brother Paul, you're an awesome preacher. Listen, you need to be a pastor. Listen, you're doing things right. You're raising your kids right. Things are awesome going with you. Things are great. But when you disagree with them, then it kind of turns around. See, the counsel of men fluctuates. When you disagree with them, you know what they say then? Well, I never trusted him. He was never worth anything. From the time he came on the property, I've never trusted him. You better watch him. That's the way people operate. Even good people. Men's counsel fluctuates. You better be careful listening to compliments. I've learned that. I've only been in the ministry about 10 or well, I keep saying 10 years, but time keeps going. It's been about 12 now. But I mean, when you compare that to Brother Joe, listen, Brother Joe passed out tracts with Abraham. I've only been in the ministry just a little bit. But I've learned that you better be careful with compliments. Boy, when somebody I respect and admire slapped me on the back and just give me a list of them. But the first time I was at odds with them, first time I didn't see it the way they saw it, then it got rocky. But can you imagine getting counsel from Jesus? Listen, I was laying in bed thinking about it. It was giving me chills. He wanted to get them off by themselves. He wanted to talk to them. But what happened here? Something happened. See, a need came up. A need came up. Jesus saw the multitude and was moved with compassion. And number one, if we want to have revival, we're going to need to be motivated by compassion. We're going to have to allow our rest and our recreation and our relaxation to be interrupted at times. It's going to have to be interrupted at times. Listen, when I first came up with this message, it put me under conviction. Because there was one certain thing, and I'm not going to tell you what it is, but there was a certain thing that I was struggling with. There was a certain church function that I just felt like I needed to be at. I felt like I needed to be there. But I said, Lord, it'll wear me out to do that. I can't do that. I felt like I needed to go. And I'd been struggling with it for a while, and I'd go back and forth on it. I'd go back and forth. But then when I saw this, I said, I just need to be there. I just need to be there. See, there's going to be times, if we're going to encourage others, if we're going to have revival, we're going to have to allow our rest and our relaxation to be interrupted, not because we're trying to impress the pastor, not because the pastor's putting pressure on us. Brother Owen has never put any pressure on me, not overtly anyway. He's never put any pressure on me. Listen, at some point we got to get to the stage in our lives where we do it because it's right. We do it because we see the need for it. We do it because we want to encourage others, and not because of external forces. Me and Zach Knight, one of our Bible college students, we used to discuss pressure all the time. There's a lot of different views on pressure. I have a very distinct view on pressure that I'm not changing on. I'm not changing on it. See, pressure should be applied. Pressure should be applied gradually in a controlled environment. It ought to be done in a controlled environment. You ought to see what people's threshold is and push them and watch them grow and develop. But that's not going to be enough. See, external forces is not going to be enough to motivate somebody. That's only going to get you about halfway across the pond, because if you're only doing it for me, or if you're only doing it for Brother Owen, or if you're only doing it for Brother Donnell, what are you going to do when those people aren't around? At some point, maturity develops when you see, yeah, Brother Paul taught me some things. Zach Knight, we discussed, he said, you taught me some things, but he's not with me anymore. He's not with me anymore. I didn't call him this morning to see if he went to church. He's teaching Sunday school right now. He's the new Sunday school teacher in Eufaula, Alabama. He's teaching the adult Sunday school. But I didn't call him to check on him to make sure he's got to do that on his own. See, if we're going to have revival, we're going to have to see on our own that sometimes we have to allow our rest and our relaxation to be interrupted. And support the church, support the pastor, encourage others. That's what Jesus did here. That's what he did here. He gave them a plan. Do you think Jesus knew what was about to happen? He gave them the plan, but obviously he said, listen, he said, I want to. He said unto them, come. Verse 31, ye yourselves apart in a desert place and rest a while, for there were many coming and going, and they had no leisure so much as to eat. And they departed into a desert place by ship privately. And the people saw them departing, and many knew him, and ran afoot thither out of all the cities, and out went them, and came together unto him. And Jesus, when he came out, saw much people, and was moved with compassion toward them, because they were as sheep, not having a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. So here he allowed his rest to be interrupted. He allowed his recreation to be interrupted. Listen, there's nothing wrong with rest. I'm not one of those preachers that gets on people for taking vacations. Listen, you need rest. You need rest. If you're not a person that sleeps late on a regular basis, and then one morning you don't have a lot going on and you sleep later than usual, you know why you did that? Because your body needs it. It needs it. So I'm not one of those people that's against rest and relaxation, but there's times when if you're paying attention, if you're motivated by compassion, if you're receptive, you're going to notice there's a need that's so great, I've got to allow my rest and my relaxation to be interrupted. And if we're going to have revival, we're going to need to see when that occurs. We're going to need to see when that's the situation. Okay, I want to do this, but this is a greater need over here. I've got to go over here and do this. And that's what he did. And notice he taught them all day. And he began to teach them many things. The last line in verse 34, and when the day was now far spent, his disciples came unto him and said, this is a desert place, and now the time is far past. Send them away that they may go into the country round about into the villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. Now, I don't want to be critical of the disciples here. Listen, the apostles, listen, they did more for the cause of Christ than I probably ever will. When Christ went back to heaven, as far as I know, all the disciples, except of course for Judas Iscariot who betrayed Jesus, as far as I know, all the disciples died a martyr's death. As far as I know, except for which one? John, okay. Yeah, because he was on the Isle of Patmos. Is that okay? All right, but they founded the early church. They're the ones that promoted them and the Apostle Paul. So I'm not being critical of them at all. But at this point in their ministry, they were still growing. At this point in their ministry, they still had some maturity issues, you might say. Listen, in reading the Gospels, I was surprised at how often their solution was, send them away. Send them away. Now, they weren't being hateful here. They were simply saying, Lord, we were tired when we got here. You ever been like that? You were tired when you got here. Lord, we were tired when we got here. You told us to get off privately, and then this came up, and now, listen, we've dealt with them all day. We've dealt with them all day. Listen, they weren't sending away poor hungry people. It's not what they were doing. They were simply saying, let them go home so they can get something to eat. You know what that means? When somebody says, well, I'm going to let you go so you can get some rest, you know what they're saying? They need some rest. Well, I'm going to let you go. I don't want to keep you. but they were saying, Lord, send them away so we can get something to eat. And there's nothing wrong. I'm not being critical of the disciples. And you know what Jesus said? He said, you give them something to eat. You give them something to eat. And you know what they said? Look at verse 37. He answered and said unto them, give ye them to eat. And they say unto him, shall we go and buy 200 pennies worth of bread and give them to eat? He saith unto them, how many loaves have ye? And see. And when they knew, they say 5 and 2 fishes. So here, number one, we got to be motivated by compassion. We have to allow our rest and our relaxation at times to be interrupted when we see how great the need is. But a lot of times, we're so busy doing our own thing that we don't even notice the need. Number two, we need to be mindful of our perspective. We need to be mindful of our perspective. See, the disciples had the wrong perspective. They had the wrong perspective. Now, number one, as far as having the wrong perspective, their solution was to send them away. And then, number two, they didn't notice the power at their disposal. See, they were only looking at it from a human standpoint. And if you look at one of the other Gospels, he says, if we do this, he says, everybody's going to get a little. If we go and buy something to eat, well, everybody will have enough to get a little. Why didn't they perform a miracle? Why didn't they perform a miracle? They did it at the first part of Mark 6. They went out to the neighboring villages and performed miracles. Christ gave them the power to perform miracles, and they did it. They raised the dead, they healed the sick, they cast out devils. Why didn't they think to perform a miracle here? And again, I'm not being critical. I'm not being critical. Listen, it just took them a while to learn some things. It took them a while to get the rough edges off, Brother Joe. I wonder how long it's going to take me. I'm 41 years old. I'm 41 years old. And see, now we make mistakes all the way out. We're always learning. But I wonder how long it's going to take me to learn the basics. See, they hadn't even learned the basics yet. They had just left. They had just come back from a Bible college course, if you will. They had just come back from preaching and teaching and performing miracles. Here they must have been distracted. They had just come back from preaching and teaching and performing miracles. They had just gotten back. But not only did they not think to perform a miracle, they didn't even ask Him to perform a miracle. They were with the Creator of the universe. They were with their Messiah. They had seen Him perform miracles. And they didn't ask Him. They didn't say, Lord, what can you do about this? They didn't step up to the plate and do anything themselves. All they saw was the problem. We got to be mindful of our perspective. If we're and I'm preaching directly to myself because I am more negative than any 10 people in here. I'm preaching to myself. They had all this power at their disposal, and it didn't even cross their mind. It didn't even cross their mind. Not only did they have Christ with them, but they themselves had performed miracles. They themselves had performed, but it didn't occur to them once. See, the Bible says in 1 Timothy chapter 4, it says, preach the word, be instant, in season. See, that's at 9:45 on Sunday morning. I'm supposed to be ready to preach. That's in season. That's at about 7:30 on Wednesday night when Renita gets through with all the singing and all the verses. I'm supposed to be ready to preach. That's Tuesday and Thursday at 11 o'clock in the morning. I'm supposed to be ready to preach. That's in season. See, they had just gotten back from in season. Man, they had preached and they taught and they were excited and they performed miracles. They were focused. They were focused. But right now, the day's far spent. They're tired and they're hungry. See, that's out of season. They missed an opportunity. They missed an opportunity. And Jesus gave it to them. Jesus handed it to them. He said, you give them something to eat. You give them something to eat. And it didn't even occur to them that they had the power within them to do it. Didn't even occur to them. See, out of season is when I lay down at about 9 o'clock and I've got 3 phone calls from a person that I just really don't want to talk to right that minute. Because I know that when I get on the phone with him, he's not going to have 2 or 3 jokes for me and tell me to have a good evening and hang up. He's going to want to talk about some deep problem he's got, and I'm going to tell him the same thing I've been telling him for a month. That's out of season. That's out of season. It says, preach the word, be instant, in season, out of season. If we're going to have revival, not only are we going to have to allow our rest and relaxation to be interrupted for the sake of the people. In our case, for the sake of the church. You say, Brother Paul, Brother Paul, I'm tired. Saturday's my only day off. I don't want to come to men's prayer meeting. I don't want to come to men's prayer meeting. Well, that's between you and the Lord. But I know this. Maybe you're just the person to walk through the door that would encourage the pastor or somebody else. And Brother Owen says within himself, he says, man, it sure is good to see them here. It sure is. Listen, we don't ever think about the pastor getting discouraged. He's always happy. He's always joking. He's never in a bad mood as far as publicly. I don't know what he does privately. But listen, he's always upbeat. But we don't ever think about, doing what needs to be done and going above and beyond and doing a little bit extra. Allowing our rest. Well, he allows his rest to be interrupted. He's at men's prayer meeting every week, unless he goes out of town or something. You don't think he'd like to sit home once in a while with his feet up? I say that. I don't like getting on my couch. It's too hard to get off of. But for the normal person, they want to sit down and put their feet up. If we're going to have revival, we're going to have to allow our rest and our relaxation to be interrupted for the good of the people, for the good of someone else. Number two, we got to be mindful. We've got to be mindful of our perspective. We've got to be mindful to see the disciples here. These are men who would be great men of God. But here they still had some learning to do. Here they still had some things to deal with. These are men, and when I realized by going through all this, see, that's why I try to read up, because you'll see some things you didn't see before. But when I realized that these disciples at this point in their ministry had already performed miracles. They'd already done it. But it didn't even occur to them to perform a miracle and feed these people. And Jesus gave it to them. He said, you give them something to eat. And by the way, he was talking about physical. He'd already fed them spiritually. He taught them all day. But their perspective was wrong. They were looking at the problem rather than the solution. And they were with the ultimate solution. I mean, they were in the company of the man who's the solution to every problem. And all they were looking at was the human standpoint. They were thinking, well, buy them something and everybody will get a little, I guess. I guess that's what we'll do. So number one, we got to be motivated by compassion. We got to allow our rest to be interrupted at times for the good of the church, for the good of the people. Number two, we got to be mindful of our perspective. Let's not focus on the problem. Let's focus on the solution. And number three, there's two more left. Number three, go down to look at verse 40. Oh, by the way, talking about perspectives, a couple times they called this a desert place. They called this the desert place. What did Jesus say in the last line in verse 39? He said, set them upon the green grass. Set them upon the green grass. See, it's all in how you look at things. Maybe one day, maybe in 10 years, I'll be like Brother Owen. I'll get enough of this in my head and I'll stand up and say, well, not stand up, but I'll say, everything's going to be fine. I don't know. I can't imagine me saying that. I say it from my wife sometimes, but I don't believe it all the time. But see, that they were talking about a desert place. A couple of times they called it, but Jesus here. Now I know it was a desert place in that it was off by itself, but they were speaking of it in one context kind of negatively. We're out in the middle of nowhere, But what did Jesus see? He saw it. It don't just say grass. It says green grass. He saw the green grass. It's all a matter of perspective. We got to be mindful of our perspective. And they sat down in ranks by hundreds and fifties, and when he had taken the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, he looked upon heaven and blessed them to his disciples to set before them. And the 2 fishes divided he among them all, and they all did eat and were filled. They didn't just get a little. My dad used to tell me, you get 2 chicken legs, boy, then you got to let everybody else eat. Don't be piling up 5 chicken legs on your plate. I long for the day. I long for the day when I could eat 5 chicken legs. I thought about it on a regular basis. I thought about it. You say, Brother Paul, that's weird. I thought about it. And guess what? Now that now I got my own house and I buy all the food, and I don't eat 5 chicken legs. Because it's got to be enough to go around. Johnny ate 4 the other day. 6 years old. I said, son, you can eat all you want, but you got to eat all you get. He ate 4 of them. Broke my heart. Because I had my eye on one. I had my eye on one. He swiped it up, Brother Donnell. He swiped it up. And we sing that song, Jesus and Others and You. What a wonderful way to spell joy. You know, put yourself last. And he thinks about that except when there's chicken on the table. See, but they all ate and were filled. They didn't just get a little. Little is much when God is in it. Labor not for wealth or fame. Little is much when God's in it. They all did eat and were filled, verse 43, and they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments and other fishes. 12 baskets full. If we're going to have revival, we better be mindful of what we do. We better be mindful of what we do with God's resources. I don't know if you notice it or not, but the resources that we have, we didn't build any of that. That was built before us. A lot of people in this room paid a price and saw this ministry come up from nothing. And we look at it now, we're reaping the benefits. We're reaping the benefits. We ought to be mindful of what God does. Because to be all willy-nilly with God's resources and to not care about God's resources, you know what that represents? Represents an unthankful heart. Now, we don't know who these 12 baskets fulls went to. I like to think that they gave them to that little boy. That's what I like to think. Can you imagine? His mama is sitting in a recliner at the house. She's sitting in a recliner, you know, she's got her TV on, watching Fox News, Lord help her. She's watching Fox News, and the little boy said, Mama, I've heard Jesus is in town. I'm going to go see Jesus. And he's got his one little basket with his 5 loaves and his 2 fishes. And he leaves. And later on in the day, she hears a knock at the door. And somebody comes in. He's like, Mom, this is a friend of mine. They had to help me carry some stuff home. He had 2 or 3 baskets on his arm. And she said, well, that's funny. She said, I only sent him out with 1. I hope he didn't steal that. I hope he didn't get into mischief. I hope he didn't get into his name was probably Johnny. She said, that's a real Jewish name, you know. She said, I hope little Johnny didn't get into mischief. Well, then somebody else comes in carrying some more baskets. And then somebody else comes in carrying some more baskets. And then somebody else comes in, and for the rest of that little boy's life, every chance he gets, he's an old man. He's about Brother Stone's age. He's an old man, and he tells a story of the time when they had more food in that house at one time than they had ever had. I don't know if they were poor. I don't know if they were rich. We don't know. Maybe they had just enough, Brother Joe. But he tells the story because one man allowed his rest to be interrupted. Because one man who always had the right perspective. He always looked at things the right way. That little boy told that story for the rest of his life. See, well, but I don't. Now I like to think that's the way it happened. I don't know if it is or not. I can't prove it. But I know this. What they took up wasn't wasted. We better be mindful of what God gives us. We better be mindful of what we do with God's resources. We better do what we can to protect God's resources. Whether anybody else likes it or not, we better protect them. We better stand up and protect. We better stand up and be counted. We better be mindful of God's if we're going to have revival, we need to get a new appreciation We need to get a new appreciation for what God can do and a new thankfulness for His resources. They took up 12 baskets full. And finally, number 4. Go down to verse. By the way, if you go to Matthew 14, this account here where Jesus walks on water is the same account where Peter walks on water. They don't mention it here, but in Matthew 14, Peter says, "Bid me come unto you," and Jesus said, "Come." And of course, Peter walked on water. And also, in Matthew 15, he does this again. But this time, there are 7 loaves and a few fishes. If you read Matthew 15, it talks about there being 7 loaves and a few fishes. Doesn't say exactly how many. It says 7 loaves and a few fishes. And again, he took up, and in that case, he took up 7 baskets full. They took up 7 baskets full. But here, so he walks on the water, and they see him, and they're afraid. I'm not going to read it all for a second time. Verse 50, can you imagine? Now, just the thought of being on the water scares me. I can't imagine being out in the middle of the water in the dark. Just thinking about that terrifies me. But can you imagine being in the dark and there's water everywhere, and all of a sudden you see somebody walking on the water? That would scare me slap to death. That would terrify me. People aren't supposed to be able to walk on the water. That's what I've been told. And Jesus was, and look at verse 50. For they saw him and were troubled, and immediately he talked with them and saith unto them, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. And he went up unto them into the ship, and the wind ceased, and they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure, and wondered. Look at verse 52. For they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. For they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. If we're going to have revival, we better allow our minds to be refreshed about what God's already done for us. This time last year, my little baby girl, they kept telling me there was something wrong with her. And they kept telling me there was something wrong with her. And they ran tests. And I prayed and prayed. And I've said publicly, I never asked God to heal her. I never did. Not once. Maybe I should have. What I was focusing on was, all right, we got to be pragmatic about this, because I've got a disability. My mother's and father's prayers, for whatever reasons, were not answered in this regard, as far as healing me. But so I was saying, Lord, give me what I need to be the leader I need to be and get through this. I was still going to the Lord. I was going to the Lord hourly sometimes. I just didn't have that particular. My wife, she said, Lord, I don't want to fool with this. I want you to just take it away. And by the way, it's okay to tell the Lord what you want. He knows anyway. There's nothing wrong with telling the Lord what you want. And God saw fit to answer her prayer. And now, and I'm not going to be gross, but it had something to do with her not being able to poop. That's what it was about. So you've never heard me complain one time about a dirty diaper. And I've had to change a few of them. You've never heard me complain one time about a dirty diaper. And you've never heard my wife, we say, thank the Lord Coley's pooping. Thank the Lord Coley's pooping. Now you say, Brother Paul, that is undignified. You know, Miss Stone's over there, she's a real dignified lady. I'm not real dignified. Brother Paul, that's undignified. Listen, we better be reminded on a regular basis of what God has already brought us through. If we're going to have revival, you think back in your mind about what the Lord's done for you in the past. Listen, Brother Dewey tells that story about putting the shoes in the offering. Just gives me chills every time he tells it. Putting the shoe, that was a long time ago, Brother Dewey. Long time ago. There's no telling what the Lord's got in front of you. There's no telling what the Lord's got in front of me. There's no telling what the Lord's got in front of Faith Baptist Church as a whole. But if we're going to have revival, what God's brought us through, and the power of God, and God's love for us and compassion for us, that better always be fresh on our mind. Brother Joe, it's been a day or two ago since you boiled that bone. It's been a day or two ago. By the way, he's not still boiling bones. God's taking care of him. God was taking care of him then. God just sent him through that valley to teach him something. And he's told that story over and over again. God's brought Brother Donnell through some things. God's brought Brother and Mrs. Rowan through some things. If we're going to have revival, we better get a rejuvenated attitude about what God's done for us. These disciples here missed it. They considered not the miracle of the loaves and fishes, for their heart was hardened. Number one, if we're going to have revival, we need to be motivated by compassion. We're going to have to allow our rest to be interrupted. Number two, we better be mindful of our perspective. Don't always look at the problem, look at the solution. Go to the book. Go to the book. Number three, we better be aware and thankful concerning God's resources. We better be aware and thankful concerning God's... We better stand up and be counted to protect what God's given us and protect His resources. And number four, we need to be reminded of what God's already done for us. It needs to be fresh on our minds. Listen, if we will do these four things, there's a lot of other things we could do. And of course, I'm talking to believers. Now, revival, like Brother Rowan says, a lot of times we look at revival, we want people to get saved, and that's fine, but revival's for the church. Revival's for the saved. There's nothing wrong with evangelizing and trying to... Listen, we want people to get saved every service. But like Brother Chris said this morning, if you're not saved, you can't get revived. You got to get saved. Revival's for us. And if we'll do these four things, we'll begin to have revival, and it'll grow and continue long after the meetings have ceased. These four things. I'm going to ask Brother Julian Vipin, if you would, sir, to stand and close us in prayer.